Controversy. That's what everybody wants. Nobody wants, simple decision making and rational thinking. People want the big headlines. Video games are melting our brains. Or somebody died in a cafe while playing video games. Now, I've always been on the fence with this. I think there's a place for video games. I personally love video games. I have spent countless hours playing video games. I'm pretty sure you knew that by just looking at the background or taking a look at my shirt. And, frankly, I would be playing video games right now if it wasn't for a few things. Number one, I started to have a realization through a journey that I've taken over the past year, how much time I was spending playing video games. And, once again, I'm not knocking it. I love narrative. I love gameplay. I love the time that I was spending with individuals that I was playing games with. This is not me disparaging video games. It is me having the honest conversation with both myself and anybody that is interested in my thought process about how much is too much, and are we being manipulated into this perpetual loop of relying on video games rather than using them potentially as a tool. It's one thing to become a slave to something, and it's another thing to use it so that it helps you with a particular skill set that you're trying to hone, or a particular deficiency that you may have. I've read books like McGonagall's book on reality is broken, and she talks about how it's a boon to us to have video gaming in our society, because basically what it's doing is it's filling in some gaps that have always been filled with fun and enjoyment and excitement that comes from things like video games. But once again, we have a habit as a species to take anything good and go in a very negative, over-consuming direction, and we don't realize we're being manipulated. There's lots of stuff in the headlines about microtransactions. There's lots of stuff about people that are becoming addicted, becoming less social, and for me, the big catalyst was just the time. If I'm spending, let's say, 2 hours in the day playing a video game, and depending on the video game, if it's not bringing me anything new, let's separate genres for a second. Let's talk about something like like a Madden or like a first-person shooter. Something like that isn't necessarily giving you any kind of context and bringing you any kind of additional information that's going to be necessary for you to either grow or survive. Some could argue that some narrative games, games that would involve storytelling elements, or some kind of some kind of a narrative that will push your thought process into an area that you might not have gone into unless you had been presented with that through the medium of video games. There's a lot of you know themes that you might find in a book, but because you're a video gamer, that's the only way that you're going to be able to absorb that kind of thought process and that kind of potential value set. So there's that aspect of things. But we're talking about two different things. We're talking about many facets of the gaming industry. What I'm worried about, and what I was worried about with myself, is are those games that don't necessarily have inherent value taking up all of my time because I've been caught up in this perpetual loop of dopamine release, dopamine release, dopamine release. And for those who don't know what that is, that's basically a chemical in your brain that gets released and gives you pleasure. It makes you happy. The problem is that it's temporary. The problem is that when it goes away, you want it again. So you become addicted, and you go back to it, and go back to it. And this is from a person that loves that dopamine release. I love it. I, I, I love video games. I'm still gonna play some today, even after this little manifesto. The only reason I'm bringing this up, and the only reason I'm even talking about it, is a part of it is an affirmation for myself. I'm not going to be a slave to something that could be potentially a tool. I'm not going to allow something to engulf my precious time unless there's some kind of a justification for what it is that I'm spending that time doing. And in the way that I broke that cycle for myself was just scheduling time to do other things like reading a book, or working. I own my own business, so doing things of that nature. Growing, from an educational standpoint, just me going out there and researching and reading and absorbing content that has something to do with growing as a person. And then realizing that there were times when I wanted to play, and I asked myself, could I be doing this instead? Could I finish this book? Or could I watch this documentary? Or could I, absorb this new piece of information? Or could I finish that, report I needed to create for my business? Ultimately, that thought process was what caused me to play video games less. Was that I started to weigh my options rather than just conceding to the addiction or the need of that dopamine release. And that's a hard thing to explain how I got to that point. It's a much more underlying problem that people tend to have, and that will take more videos. But the idea is that I needed to think about my decisions rather than just deciding based on factors that were taken away from me, controllable factors. The decision of me to play endless hours of League of Legends or endless hours of Monster Hunter You know, I remember waking up in the morning, wanting to play, playing, taking a rest, maybe to eat or something like that, and then wondering when the next time I'm going to play is. That's dangerous. And, once again, it's not to discourage. I love my games, I'll still play them. But, just like anything, there's an appreciation that you can have for things like games that you can also avoid spoiling by reducing the amount of time that you do it. It's the same idea of any kind of addiction. If you were to occasionally smoke some pot, then it would affect you in the same way every time, rather than smoking every hour on the hour every day, and now you have to smoke more in order to get the effect, to get any kind of release, dopamine release. So, and that's not me condoning pot use. It's only using the example of addiction. The way people become addicted is they numb themselves to the ability of spreading out the enjoyment, appreciating, sitting back and realizing, what is it that I'm actually doing with the time that I have left? And for me, it was a journey of getting back control of my thoughts and my ability to say no to a game tonight. And it depresses me. I love my games. I love the hobby. I continue to. And I know that part of me isn't dead, but I know that it's less emphasized. And, there's that part of me is the depressed part. The part that's going away slowly, or at the very least becoming less prominent in my decision making process. The part that's productive and getting things done and thinking about things in a different way, both from a health perspective and a mental perspective and a productive perspective. That part is grateful that I was able to break from those chains. So, hopefully, this little manifesto about breaking the chains from a video game addiction will help, and I hope to talk to you again soon. My name is Alex. Bye-bye.